When the doctor told me my son had been in a devastating car crash, I rushed to the hospital with my heart already breaking at the thought of losing my only child. I was about to push open the operating room door when a nurse suddenly grabbed my arm. "Don't go in there. Hide, this is a trap. Please trust me." My son was inside fighting for his life, and everything in me wanted to go in. But something in her terrified eyes made me stop. Minutes later, I uncovered a horrifying truth about my own son. Hello everyone, welcome to this story. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And just a quick note. Some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any similarities in names or places are purely coincidental. The red light above Operating Room 3 pulsed like a dying heart, and I was running toward it, my wet shoes screaming against the sterile linoleum. I am Thane Garrison, a 68-year-old retired aerospace engineer whose life of meticulous calculation had never prepared me for the variable of my own son's malice. Rain from the Cleveland storm still clung to my coat, dripping onto the floor as I skidded toward the double doors. I could see the silhouette of a surgeon through the frosted glass, and my chest felt as though it were being crushed by a hydraulic press. Silas was in there. My only boy, my pride supposedly broken and bleeding on a table while I stood helpless on the other side of the steel. I reached for the cold, abrasive texture of the steel OR door handle, my fingers trembling with a frantic, desperate energy. Just as my palm made contact, a firm, calloused grip latched onto my forearm with the strength of a vice. I was yanked backward with such violence that my heels left the floor, pulled into a dark supply alcove, tucked between the heavy linen carts. A woman in forest green scrubs appeared, Audrey Walsh, a 29-year-old ICU nurse whose urgent grip on my arm was the only thing standing between me and my grave. She pressed a palm over my mouth, the smell of industrial-grade bleach on her skin flooding my senses. "Don't make a sound if you want to live," she hissed into my ear, her frantic, hot breath making my skin crawl. "This floor isn't what it looks like, Mr. Garrison. The hospital staff on this level are part of a coordinated renovation specifically cleared to allow a private murder." I struggled against her, my muffled cries of protest dying in the back of my throat. "My son is in there." I managed to wheeze as she momentarily loosened her hand. "He's dying. Let me go. Stop. Breathe." If I walked through that door, I was a dead man. The weight of her words began to settle into my bones, cold and heavy. I looked at this stranger, this nurse who was risking everything to hold me back. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the hallway, where the flickering hum of the emergency lights created a rhythmic, nauseating stutter. "This isn't a hospital tonight," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my pulse. "It's a slaughterhouse, and you are the guest of honor. You think you're here to say goodbye to a dying son, but the surgery is a staged execution. Blackwell isn't fixing a spine. He's waiting for you to walk in so he can declare a second emergency." The hospital smell, bleach and sickness suddenly felt like the scent of a baited cage. "How do you know about this?" I demanded, my voice a jagged shadow of its former self. "How do you know my name?" She leaned closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "I know about the $5.2 million insurance policy you signed last month," she said. "I know Silas is the sole beneficiary. I know because I've been watching Blackwell for months, counting the bodies that never made it to the morgue." I felt the air leave the room. My mind, usually so sharp with numbers and trajectories, began to fracture. Then a sound drifted through the thin drywall of the alcove. It wasn't the beep of a heart monitor or the clatter of surgical tools. It was a laugh. I pressed my eye to the gap in the shelving and saw my son Silas walking toward me without a single scratch on his face, a celebratory cigar in his hand. Looking at Silas through the narrow gap in the linen shelves wasn't like looking at my son. It was like staring at a hollowed-out statue of the boy I'd spent 37 years building. His hands, those hands I had taught to hold a wrench and steady a compass, were perfectly calm as he tapped ash from a thick cigar. There was no tremor of grief, no frantic pacing of a man whose father lay dying on a steel table. The visual was a physical blow that sent my mind reeling backward, seeking shelter in the quiet of my Maple Heights apartment. I could almost smell the old wood of our library and the faint, lingering trail of Margaret's lavender perfume. It had been 3 years of crushing silence since her funeral, a silence I filled with unwavering loyalty to Silas. I had convinced myself he was just a troubled soul drowning in the debt of that failed development project. "Take care of him," Thane Margaret had whispered in my memory as the cancer took her. "He's all we have." I had made her a solemn promise that I would never let him fall, a vow that had blinded me to the rot spreading beneath the surface of his charm. How could I have been so blind? I was an aerospace engineer. I was trained to see the structural failure before the bridge collapsed. I looked for the physics of the world, for the logic in the tension, but I had ignored the most obvious fracture in my own home. I remembered 5 weeks ago the way Silas sat in my worn leather recliner, his face a carefully constructed mask of false concern. He had fanned out the paperwork for a $5.2 million Guardian life policy, as if he were presenting a gift. "It is just for our collective security, Dad," he had said, the ink scratching against the form with a sound like a predator's claws. I told him I was on a fixed income and couldn't afford the staggering premiums, but he had merely smiled that cold, practiced smile. "It's just for peace of mind. Why are you making this so difficult?" He had even insisted on an accidental death double indemnity rider, framing it as a standard feature for men my age. "You have to understand, when it's your own blood, you don't look for the poison. You just assume it's part of the life-giving flow. You assume the hand reaching for yours is there to steady you, not to push you into the dark." My mind drifted further back to the afternoon the phone first rang, the bitter taste of cold, stale coffee still on my tongue. The woman on the other end had identified herself as Dr. Emily Grant, calling about a horrific car accident on the interstate. As I sat huddled in this hospital alcove, the weight of the heavy linen sheets pressing against my shoulders, the phrasing of her call suddenly echoed in my mind. It was identical to a crisis management script I'd seen sitting on the corner of Silas's office desk months prior. Every beat, every pause for emotional effect was a rehearsed line. The realization hit me harder than the cold hospital air. The call wasn't a warning, it was the first stage of my own funeral. Audrey's fingers tightened on my arm, the pressure dragging me back from the ghosts of my apartment to the lethal reality of the hallway. The son I had promised to protect was currently waiting for the doctor to tell him I was dead. The silence in my apartment was so thick, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, a steady pulse that stopped the moment the landline screamed. It was a shrill electronic shriek, an outdated sound that felt like a needle scratching across the surface of my quiet evening. Looking back, the precision of that moment was chilling. The woman on the other end called the landline specifically because she knew exactly where I would be sitting at that hour, anchored to the armchair by habit and old age. I am Thane Garrison, and my life of engineered certainties was about to be dismantled by a voice that sounded like polished ice. "This is Dr. Emily Grant from St. Catherine Medical Center," the voice said, delivering the news with a clinical urgency that bypassed my every defense. "Mr. Garrison, your son has been involved in a high-impact collision on Interstate 90. He has sustained catastrophic spinal injuries. Is he alive?" I managed to choke out the taste of copper filling my mouth as I bit my lip in a sudden instinctive terror. "Please tell me he is breathing." The voice didn't waver, detailing the critical nature of the emergency and the need for immediate surgical intervention. I felt the air leave the room. The visual of the rain beginning to lash against the window pane seemed to mirror the storm blooming in my chest. Critical, stable, emergency. The words were bullets, and I was the target. I was 68 years old, but in that moment I was a child again, terrified of the dark and the sudden violent void where my family used to be. My Promethean promise to Margaret to never let Silas fall echoed in my ears, a heavy, suffocating weight. I fumbled for my coat, the smell of damp wool rising as I dragged it from the closet. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped my brass keys, twice the metallic clatter on the floorboards, sounding like a funeral knell. I looked at the framed photo of Silas on the side table, his gap-toothed childhood smile a relic of a boy I still believed lived somewhere inside the man. "I am coming, Silas," I whispered to the empty room. "Just hold on. God, don't let him be the one to leave me too." Every second I spent struggling with my shoes felt like an eternity, a frantic, desperate waste of time I didn't have. I was fueled by a manufactured panic, a chemical surge that blinded me to everything but the road to the hospital. As I finally grabbed my keys and made for the exit, I paused for the briefest of seconds. My eyes caught the heavy steel door of my floor safe in the corner. It was slightly ajar, just a sliver of darkness showing where it should have been, flush and locked. I didn't have time to wonder why. I didn't have time to ask who had been in my home or what had been taken. My son was dying and nothing else mattered. I slammed the door behind me, oblivious to the fact that I was leaving my safety to run straight into the jaws of a predator. I was sprinting toward my silver Lexus, ready to brave the lashing storm, never realizing that the very panic driving me was a leash held by the hand of my own blood. I hit the garage stairs at a run, my mind a blur of spinal cords and insurance riders. The silver Lexus screamed as I forced it onto Interstate 90, the tires fighting for grip against a sheet of rain that felt like a physical weight on the roof. I had slammed the apartment door on my safety, but the real predator was out here lurking in the blinding gray spray thrown up by 18-wheelers. My hands were clamped so tightly onto the steering wheel that the leather groaned under my white-knuckled grip, and the vibration of the road traveled straight up my spine. Every nerve in my body was a live wire. I threw the car into the fast lane, the rhythmic, violent slap of the windshield wipers failing to keep pace with the deluge. In the rearview mirror, headlights blurred into white smears through the fog, but one set remained constant. A black SUV hung back in the mist, maintaining the exact same erratic speed I was pushing, following my lane changes like a shadow made of iron. I pushed the thought away, focusing on the needle of the speedometer. I had to reach Silas. A memory flickered in my mind, unbidden and sharp. Silas at 7 years old, bloodied knees and tear-streaked face after a tumble from his bicycle. I had scooped him up then, promising him that as long as I was breathing, nothing would ever truly break him. "I was coming, Margaret," I whispered into the empty cabin. "I am keeping my promise." The smell of hot brakes and ozone filled the car as I swerved to avoid a slow-moving tanker, the tires chirping in a momentary protest against the water-slicked asphalt. Hydroplaning. The car lifted. For 3 seconds I was flying, and the only thing beneath me was the abyss. Gravity eventually reclaimed its due. The car slamming back down with a jolt that rattled my teeth, but my foot never left the accelerator. I fumbled for the hands-free button on the console, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to call Natasha Crane, Silas's fiancée. She was a 34-year-old marketing executive with a penchant for expensive silk and a gaze that always seemed to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit. We had never been close, but she was the only one who loved him as much as I did. Or so I believed. The phone rang 4, 5, 6 times before she answered. Her voice sounded groggy, filtered through the muffled, tinny speakers of the car. "Natasha, it is Thane. There has been an accident. Silas is at St. Catherine." There was a pause, a beat too long, a silence too smooth. Oh my God," she said, her voice rising in a way that felt like a rehearsal. "St. Catherine, I will be there as soon as I can." Why wasn't she crying? If the love of your life was under a surgeon's knife, wouldn't your voice break? Wouldn't you be screaming for details, demanding to know if he was still whole instead? She let out a long, shuddering breath, that sounded more like relief than terror. "I'm sure Dr. Blackwell is doing everything he can," she added quickly. My breath hitched. I hadn't mentioned a doctor. I hadn't even mentioned that Silas was in surgery yet. The grain of doubt that had been a speck in my mind suddenly grew into a jagged stone. She hung up before I could ask how she knew Dr. Blackwell's name, and the silence that followed in the cabin was louder than the storm outside. The massive concrete monoliths of St. Catherine Medical Center emerged from the gray mist, like ancient tombstones, their heights swallowed by the low-hanging storm clouds. I abandoned my Lexus in the emergency lane, the engine still ticking with a metallic protest, as the sliding glass doors of the lobby hissed open like the mouth of a waiting beast. I stepped inside the transition from the roaring storm to the absolute suffocating silence of the interior, making my ears pop. There was no bustle of triage nurses, no distant sirens, no frantic families weeping in plastic chairs. Instead, I saw vast stretches of the lobby cordoned off with opaque plastic sheeting that rustled in the draft of the climate control. Yellow caution tape fluttered like warning flags from the ceiling, and signs marked "under renovation" were taped to every other pillar. A single security guard sat behind a high desk, his expression as vacant as the room around him. I rushed toward him, my rain-soaked shirt clinging to my back with a cold, damp weight that made me shiver. "Where is everyone?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the strain of the night. My son, Silas Garrison, was just brought in from a high-impact collision. The guard didn't look up immediately. He slowly adjusted a logbook, and as he moved, I noticed the heavy, tactical-style combat boots. He wore black, reinforced leather that looked better suited for a riot than a hospital lobby. "Renovation, sir," he said, his voice a flat drone. "Everything is being routed through the east wing tonight. Use the service elevators at the end of the hall." He pointed a gloved finger toward a dimly lit corridor, and I didn't wait to argue. I was a man driven by the singular mission of finding my boy. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind of silence that precedes a car crash. As I reached the 5th floor, the elevators opened to a hallway that felt wrong in every measurable way. The overhead lights didn't shine. They buzzed with a rhythmic, sickly hum, flickering with an uneven frequency that set my teeth on edge. The air didn't carry the sharp, medicinal tang of an antiseptic. It smelled overwhelmingly of industrial-strength bleach, a thick, cloying scent that seemed intended to scrub away more than just germs. I navigated the fluorescent labyrinth until I found the ICU nursing station, but the desk was a ghost town. A single half-eaten sandwich sat on a paper plate, next to a glowing monitor, a testament to a hasty departure. "Hello," I called out, the sound of my own heart thudding in my ears like a drum. "Is anyone here? I am looking for Silas Garrison." Bed 12. The flickering fluorescent light was a strobe turning the hallway into a series of jagged, disconnected snapshots of a nightmare. I leaned over the counter to look at the patient log. My engineer's eye caught the detail instantly. The entry for Silas Garrison was written in ink that was still wet and glistening under the lights, while the entries directly above and below it were bone dry and dated nearly 2 weeks ago. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. Someone had just written his name there minutes before I arrived. I looked at the directory mounted on the wall behind the desk, searching for confirmation for anything that made sense. I looked at the directory again. Ward 5 was listed as a psychiatric overflow unit, not a surgical ICU. I pressed my back against the cold, painted cinder block, inching toward the square of reinforced glass that held the truth about my son. The air in this psychiatric overflow unit was heavy with the smell of my own fierce sweat, trapped beneath my damp coat. Every rhythmic click of my shoes on the linoleum sounded like a countdown. I reached the observation window of room 512, the cold, greasy residue of the glass biting into my forehead as I leaned in. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs, but it stopped dead the moment I saw him. Inside, there was no dying man on life support. There were no tubes, no ventilators, no smell of impending death. Silas sat upright in a high-backed chair, fully dressed in his custom charcoal suit, looking more vibrant and relaxed than I had seen him in years. He was leaning back with an effortless, arrogant posture, sharing a drink with Dr. Marcus Blackwell and Natasha Crane. Their laughter was muffled by the thick, reinforced glass, but their body language radiated a triumph so casual it made my skin turn to ice. I watched as Silas threw his head back in a hearty laugh, his white teeth gleaming in the warm yellow light of the room, a stark contrast to the cold blue shadows of the hall where I stood. I can't believe he actually fell for it. Silas seemed to say, his mouth forming the words with mocking precision. The old man's heart is as soft as his head. Their laughter was a serrated blade, sawing through the last few threads of my fatherly devotion. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a desecration of every sacrifice I had made for him. Doctor Blackwell, a man who had taken an oath to heal, reached into a leather folder and pulled out the Guardian Life policy, the very one I had signed with a trembling hand 5 weeks ago. He pointed a clinical finger toward the double indemnity clause, and I watched the three of them clink their glasses in a toast. Natasha reached into her designer purse and pulled out a slender, gleaming syringe, handing it to Blackwell, with a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes. She wasn't a passive observer. She was the armorer for my execution. Was this the boy I taught to ride a bike? Was this the man I bailed out of every failure only for him to see my life as his final payout to a long life for us? Blackwell's lips moved. And a short one for the donor. Zurich is going to be beautiful this time of year. I watched, paralyzed by an intellectual horror, as Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. I recognized the silver fob immediately. They were my house keys, the ones from the safe I had found ajar. He tossed them onto the empty hospital bed with a dismissive flick of his wrist, a gesture that signaled I had already been evicted from my own existence. I retreated into the shadows, my back hitting the wall as the magnitude of the conspiracy crushed the air from my lungs. I realized then that I wasn't at the hospital to save my son. I was the guest of honor at my own execution, and the clock had already started ticking. Every exit seemed to shrink. Every shadow seemed to hide a guard in tactical boots, and my own blood had become the predator I feared most. A hand clamped over my mouth, the sudden pressure pulling me back from the observation glass, just as Dr. Blackwell began to tilt his head toward the hallway. I was dragged with a strength born of frantic necessity into the shadows of a nearby doorway. The door to the staff break room clicked shut, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoing like a gavel in the sterile silence. I collapsed into a molded plastic chair, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that hurt my chest. The image of Silas, vibrant, healthy, and laughing, looped in my mind like a malfunctioning flight recorder. My own son was sharing a toast over the price of my life. Audrey Walsh didn't offer a shoulder to cry on or words of hollow comfort. Instead, she turned to the counter, pouring a cup of stale black coffee that smelled of burnt beans and ozone from the microwave. She slid the steaming mug across the laminated table, her expression as hard as flint and twice as sharp. Audrey watched me with a mixture of pity and cold calculation, waiting for the engineer in me to finally override the father. "Drink it," she commanded, her voice a low vibration beneath the high-pitched clinical whine of the central air. "You will need the caffeine to stay sharp for what comes next." I looked at the dark liquid, then up at her. He was sitting up. I whispered the words, tasting like ash. He was laughing, Audrey. My son was laughing at me. She didn't flinch. "I wasn't even supposed to be on this floor tonight, Mr. Garrison," she revealed, leaning against the vending machine that hummed beneath the floorboards. "I had to use a dead supervisor's credentials just to bypass the security lock on this renovated ward. I did it because I knew they were bringing you here. Stale coffee. It tasted like battery acid and betrayal, but I forced it down. Why would you risk your career for me?" I asked, my analytical mind finally starting to sift through the wreckage of my emotions. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn, laminated obituary. It was for a man named David Walsh. "This is my father," she said, her eyes darkening with a blood debt 12 years in the making. "He died on Blackwell's operating table under the same suspicious circumstances they're planning for you. The hospital buried the truth, but I've spent my life documenting the ghosts Blackwell leaves behind, the anesthesia reactions, the sudden hemorrhages, the convenient accidents. Blackwell doesn't just kill people, Mr. Garrison. He erases them for a fee. Do you know what it's like to realize you're already dead on paper? It makes the living part feel like a borrowed luxury." I looked at the obituary, the faded ink a testament to a dozen years of waiting. "You've been waiting 12 years for tonight," I noted. "Yes," she replied, "and you are the first piece of evidence that can actually walk and talk." She reached into her clipboard and pulled out a sheet of paper that made my heart stop a second time. It was a pre-surgical consent form. My name was at the top, and at the bottom was a perfect forgery of my signature dated for tomorrow morning. "They've already prepared the paperwork for your death." I looked at the forged signature, then at Audrey's unwavering eyes, and I realized the only way out of this hospital was over the ruins of my son's life. My fingers trembled as I pulled the smartphone from my pocket. The screen's glow feeling like a spotlight in the dark. I had spent my life as an aerospace engineer, comfortable with complexity and the brutal honesty of numbers. But as I bypassed the biometric lock, the screen's white glare exposing the deep, dark hollows where my life savings used to be, I felt like an amateur. Audrey leaned in over my shoulder, her rhythmic, patient breathing the only thing keeping me anchored to the plastic chair. I navigated to the joint bank account I had kept with Silas, a fund intended for family emergencies, a safety net for a son I thought was merely struggling with a bad real estate market. I began a digital autopsy of my own ruin. I scrolled through the transaction history, watching the numbers dwindle in large, jagged chunks over the past 3 months. It was a systematic deconstruction. I realized with a sickening jolt that each major withdrawal matched a date where Silas had visited me for dinner, acting like a loving, concerned child, while likely using my own tablet to verify the transfers. He didn't just want me dead. I whispered the blue light of the phone reflecting in my wide, dry eyes. He wanted me penniless. My thumb tapped frantically against the glass, digging deeper into the betrayal. I saw a massive transfer that relied on a secondary verification code one Silas shouldn't have known. He had used my late wife Margaret's social security number, a string of digits that should have been deactivated and buried with her, to bypass the bank's security. "Check the withdrawal locations," Thane Audrey said softly, her hand steady on the back of my chair. He wasn't paying off development debts. He was funding a discreet holding company. He's building a nest elsewhere. Do you know what it feels like to see 40 years of aerospace engineering, of overtime, of missed vacations, of calloused hands reduced to a row of zeros by your own blood? It is a humiliation that burns hotter than any anger. I found the final extraction, a $35,000 wire transfer to a company called Grant Financial, time stamped only 3 weeks ago. That was the exact day Silas had brought me that special organic coffee sitting at my kitchen table and encouraging me to rest because I looked tired. While I was nodding off from whatever he'd slipped into my mug, he was finishing the job. I cross-referenced my personal checking account and felt the cold sweat making the phone slippery in my palm. He had even set up a recurring transfer from my pension into the empty joint account, effectively siphoning my future before I could even live it. He wasn't just my son. He was my most efficient predator. 0. He left me exactly $0. "It's a scorched earth policy," Mr. Garrison, Audrey noted. "He's burning every bridge behind him, so there's nothing to return to." My thumb hovered over a red notification, blinking like a warning light. It was a pending transaction for the remaining balance of my home equity line of credit. It was scheduled to trigger at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the exact time Blackwell was slated to begin my surgery. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting the man who had already spent my ghost's inheritance. Audrey didn't say "I told you so" after I finished staring at the digital graveyard of my life savings. She just pointed toward the maintenance ladder in the corner of the break room, her eyes urging me toward a different kind of calculation. We climbed in silence, my joints protesting every rung, until we reached the intake vent. The metal beneath my chest was ice cold and smelled of stale dust, a hollow coffin of a tunnel that allowed me to look down into the room where my murder was being rehearsed. I shimmying forward, the coppery taste of dust thick in my mouth, until I reached the metal grate directly above room 512. Below us, the clinical mask had fully dropped. I watched Silas pace the small room, with a restless energy, his charcoal suit jacket draped over the bed rail. He looked annoyed, checking his watch with the same impatience he used to show when waiting for a slow waiter. "Is the dosage ready, Marcus?" he asked, his voice echoing up into the shaft with a clarity that made my stomach turn. "I don't want him lingering, Doctor." Blackwell was at the small counter, his back to Silas, as he meticulously prepped a series of clear glass vials. "Potassium chloride is efficient," Silas the surgeon replied, his tone as flat as a heart rate monitor. "It will look like his heart simply gave up under the stress of the evening. We have already scrubbed the fake accident report from the local police dispatch to ensure there are no paper trails." Hearing them discuss the chemistry of my death stripped away the last of my fatherly denial. Potassium chloride. A chemical stop sign for the heart. My heart. I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my shoulder as Audrey's nails dug into my coat, an anchor to keep me from crying out. Below us, the executioner's script continued. Blackwell explained that I would be sedated for a phantom spinal complication at dawn. Then the fatal injection would be administered under the guise of an emergency stabilization. Silas let out a short, sharp laugh. To the old man, he said, raising a glass filled with amber liquid, "May he finally be useful for something. That 5.2 million will finally buy me the respect I deserve in this city. I'll sign the certificate myself," Blackwell added. "Natural causes, high-stress environment, pre-existing hypertension. It is foolproof." Silas's laugh through the metal grate sounded like gravel hitting a casket lid. They clinked their glasses, the muffled sound of glass against glass vibrating through the floorboards and into my very bones. I watched, paralyzed by a righteous fury and a profound loathing for the boy I had raised. Then Silas reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, dark, velvet box. He flipped it open, and the overhead lights caught the fire of the diamond inside. It was Margaret's engagement ring, the one piece of her legacy I had kept hidden in the safe. He handed it to Blackwell, as if it were a common coin, a down payment for the night's work. My vision blurred with a cold rage. As they turned to leave the room, Silas stopped. He tilted his head, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked directly up at the vent, his eyes locking onto the grate with a cold, predatory intensity that made my blood turn to slush. I froze, my lungs burning, as I held my breath, wondering if he could see the silhouette of the father he had already traded for a ticket to Zurich. I dropped from the ceiling vent like a shadow, my knees buckling as I hit the utility room floor, the dust of the ducts still coating my lungs like the ash of my burnt life. I didn't dare cough, even as the grit irritated my throat. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, nearly drowning out the sound of Audrey landing softly behind me. We had scrambled backward through that metal tunnel after Silas looked toward the grate, our knees scraping against the zinc in a desperate bid to remain ghosts in the machine. Now in the cramped utility closet of the third floor, I took a moment to steady my hands. Every second was a debt I couldn't afford to pay. We slipped out and began navigating the silent mahogany-lined corridors of the executive wing, a place where the air felt thinner and more expensive. Audrey moved with a predatory grace, using her stolen supervisor card to bypass the heavy glass doors of the chief of surgery's suite. Every creak of the floorboards under my weight sounded like a gunshot to my hyper-alert ears. My mind was reeling from what I had overheard. Silas didn't just stumble into this madness. I realized then that he and Blackwell had been exchanging encrypted messages for over a year. The failure of the development project was just the final catalyst for a plan that had been breathing in the shadows long before the first bill went unpaid. "The cameras are on a 5-minute loop," Audrey whispered, her eyes scanning the ceiling. "We move now or we don't move at all." I nodded, my jaw set. "I spent 30 years designing aircraft systems, Audrey. I can handle a hospital firewall." How much of my history was a lie? Was my wife's death just a practice run for my own? The question gnawed at me as we entered Dr. Blackwell's private sanctum. The room was oppressive, thick with the scent of expensive cherry wood and the stale, lingering ghost of cigar smoke. I sat at the massive desk, feeling the cold leather beneath my damp palms. The professional engineer in me took the controls, pushing back the shattered father. I searched for a point of entry, my fingers finding a sticky note hidden beneath the corner of the keyboard. "Arrogance is always the best backdoor into a secure system," I muttered. He had written the code right there, BW_Asclepius 52. Click. The hard drive whirred. The secrets were breathing now. I entered the password, holding my breath, as the desktop icons began to populate the darkened screen, the ghostly blue glow of the monitor illuminating my haggard face. "We need the insurance files," Thane Audrey urged, leaning over me. "Nothing else matters." But my eyes were pulled to the wallpaper. It was a photograph of Blackwell standing next to my late wife, Margaret, at a hospital gala I never knew she attended. They looked comfortable, a familiarity in their smiles that turned my blood to slush. My fingers shook as I navigated toward the local drive. The rhythmic, mechanical click-clack of the keyboard was the only sound in the room, save for the distant, muffled chime of a grandfather clock in the outer office. The first file I opened wasn't an insurance document. It was a folder titled Garrison Estate Liquidation, and the date on it was 6 months before Silas ever asked me to sign that policy. I stared at the blinking cursor, the reality of my existence reduced to an inventory of assets meant for a fire sale. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat, waiting for me to descend further into the digital grave Silas had dug for me. My own name stared back at me from the screen, typed in a cold 12-point font that transformed my entire existence into a salvage operation. I felt the dry electronic heat radiating from the computer tower, a warmth that felt parasitic in the chilled air of the executive suite. I opened an email thread between Silas and Blackwell dated 3 weeks ago with the subject line, "Final Arrangements." My stomach churned with a mixture of nausea and ice-cold clarity as I read the itemized breakdown of my own death. They were negotiating my end with the clinical indifference of a car lease. Blackwell had requested a $150,000 consultation fee to be paid immediately upon the insurance payout. I realized with a jagged spike of fury that this blood contract was actually being paid out of my own pension account, which Silas had already partially liquidated behind my back. $150,000, I whispered, the metallic taste of bile rising in my throat. "That is the value of my 68 years. Audrey leaned closer, her sharp intake of breath echoing my own horror as she read the figures over my shoulder. "It is not just a fee, Thane," she said, her voice a low vibration of shared trauma. "It is a blood contract." They were discussing the viability of my heart for a staged arrest, as if they were checking the tire pressure on a junker. I clicked deeper, finding a PDF attachment that felt like a slap. It contained 2 first-class flight reservations for Silas Garrison and Natasha Crane to Zurich, Switzerland. The departure date was set for November 13th, the day after my planned surgery and subsequent funeral. They weren't even going to wait for the soil on my grave to settle before fleeing to a new life with my money. Zurich. First class. Paid for with my blood. I hope the champagne tastes like copper. A wire transfer confirmation beneath the PDF showed Silas had already moved the down payment for the identity broker mentioned in the earlier files. They were leaving me behind, in every sense of the word, shedding the name Garrison like a snake's dead skin. How do you breathe when you realize your son is checking the weather in Switzerland while planning your last gasp? I stared at the ghostly reflection of my own haggard face in the glossy monitor, barely recognizing the man looking back. My eyes were hollow, my skin the color of old parchment. Every click of the mouse felt like another shovel of dirt on my chest. I forced my fingers to move, navigating to Blackwell's calendar. A notification popped up for a meeting with a local realtor tomorrow afternoon. The purpose was to inspect and list my current apartment on the very day I was scheduled to die. It was a scorched earth policy. Silas was erasing every trace of me from the physical world. I clicked the next subfolder, Asset Liquidation, my heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The thumbnail preview loaded slowly, a blinding white screen that gradually sharpened into a high-resolution photograph. It was my family home, the place where Margaret and I had raised Silas, the place where she had taken her final breath. Straddling the front lawn, obscuring the roses she had tended with such care, was a massive sold banner I had never authorized. The finality of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I didn't scream. I didn't even gasp. I just stared at the sold sign until my vision blurred into a sea of red. The cursor didn't just hover over the file. It felt like a scalpel cutting into the only piece of my past I had left. With a trembling hand, I clicked through the real estate contract for 1,247 Maple Drive. I discovered Silas had sold it 3 weeks ago to a commercial development firm for $680,000, a price significantly under market value, clearly sacrificed for a quick close. The digital trail showed the funds were immediately diverted to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He sold our home, Audrey. I whispered, the taste of copper and dry panic filling my throat. He sold the room where I held Margaret's hand for the last time. My wife's memory was being liquidated by the very boy who had once called that house a sanctuary. The contract revealed an even deeper betrayal Silas had thrown in Margaret's vintage 1965 convertible, which I had spent years meticulously restoring in the garage as a sweetener to finalize the Karcham deal. He was liquidating his past, so there's nothing left to come back to. Audrey said, her voice tight with a sympathetic but urgent edge. I sat there, hollowed by a sacrificial rage that felt heavier than the damp, rain-drenched wool of my coat. How do you put a price on the hallway where your son took his first steps? Silas found $680,000. I forced my eyes away from the contract, the distinct flourish of Silas's signature loop taunting me from the bottom of the page. I grabbed the USB drive I had brought, shoving it into the port with a frantic lack of coordination. I had to get this evidence out of here. I initiated the copy of the entire asset liquidation subfolder and the primary insurance contracts PDF. The progress bar crawled across the screen with an agonizing lack of haste. The drive blinked blue, a sharp, rhythmic ticking in the darkness. Each flash was a page of my life being ripped out of the book. I watched the percentage rise with a technological desperation I had never known in my years at the aerospace firm. 90%. Come on, you piece of junk! I hissed, my ears straining for any vibration in the silent administrative wing. I hear someone in the hallway, Thane. Audrey hissed from the door, her silhouette tense. We need to leave. Now my heart hammered against my ribs as I saw one final document pop up in the transfer queue. It was a power of attorney form giving Silas the right to sell my car and personal effects, starting the very day of the surgery. Everything I owned was already gone. Suddenly, a desktop notification from a local crematorium appeared in the corner of the screen. Confirmation of prepaid services for T. Garrison. He hadn't just planned my death. He had already arranged to turn me to ash, immediately ensuring no toxicology report could ever prove the presence of the potassium chloride Blackwell had prepped. The drive gave one last frantic blink and went solid blue. The copy was done. I yanked the plastic from the port just as the cold, abrasive metal of the office door handle turned with a slow, heavy click. I had nowhere left to hide, but the darkness beneath the mahogany desk, my heart thumping so loudly, I feared it would betray me before the needle ever could. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I forced myself to focus on the folders appearing on Blackwell's monitor. The engineer in me knew that the financial theft was just the surface. The real mechanism of my erasure lay deeper in the legal subdirectories. I opened the folder labeled MPA and Legal, and the blue light of the screen felt like a cold fire against my haggard face. The first document was a court petition for emergency healthcare guardianship, filed just 1 week ago at Ridgemont County Superior Court. In the petition, Silas claimed I was suffering from rapid onset cognitive decline and paranoid delusions. He attached fabricated witness statements from neighbors who allegedly saw me wandering, confused in my bathrobe, forgetting where I lived. The petition requested that the court appoint him as my legal healthcare guardian, giving him the authority to make all medical decisions on my behalf, including life-ending procedures. He didn't just want me dead, he wanted me declared incompetent first. Double the payout, zero the resistance. The hospital's legal department had flagged it as pending psychiatric evaluation, scheduled for 3 days from now, an evaluation I would never have survived to attend. Attached to the guardianship petition was the psychiatric evaluation report the administrator had just delivered, pre-filled with a diagnosis of advanced dementia. The report was dated 2 weeks in the future, ready to be backdated, and signed by a complicit psychiatrist the moment I was gone. They had already written my obituary of sanity. My eyes burned as I scrolled through a series of retirement account transfer forms. They bore my signature, but it was a clumsy clinical murder of my identity. The loop on the M in Monroe was just slightly too wide a detail. Only an engineer who had spent decades checking tolerances on the Orion project would catch. He's faking my signature to steal the very air I breathe. I whispered, the indignation rising like bile. How do you fight a son who has already convinced a judge that your voice is just a symptom of a broken mind? I was being erased in real time. I dug further into the liquidation files and found an asset sale worksheet that made my blood turn to slush. It wasn't just the house, my silver Lexus, and even my rare book collection. The leather-bound first editions Margaret and I had spent 30 years hunting down were already listed as sold to private buyers. Each entry contained a transfer upon death clause signed with that same bloated, fraudulent hand. But the guardianship petition was the masterstroke. If I had walked into that operating room, if Blackwell's needle had found my vein, Silas would have immediately filed the psychiatric report with the court. Any investigation into my death would have been dismissed as the tragic end of a confused, demented old man who couldn't handle the stress of his son's accident. The legal system itself would have been his alibi. I wasn't just a man to them anymore. I was a harvest. Every missing dollar, every forged loop was a shovel full of dirt on my living body. I wasn't just a father being betrayed. I was a legal ghost, and Silas was already haunting my bank accounts and my civil rights. He had stripped me of my home, my legacy, and now my very personhood and legal standing, all while I was still drawing breath. I reached for the USB drive, my hand trembling, not with fear, but with a vibrant, calculated fury. The extraction of the data felt like pulling teeth from a corpse, but the drive finally signaled success. I secured the USB in my inner pocket, its small weight feeling like the only weapon I had left in this den of predators. My phone buzzed against my thigh, a sharp, rhythmic vibration that felt like an electric current from a predator's leash. I slipped out of Dr. Blackwell's office, the heavy door clicking behind me, and moved toward the service stairwell with the silent urgency of a ghost. Once inside the concrete throat of the stairs, I gripped the cold, metallic handrail and pulled the device out. The blue, sterile glow of the screen was blinding in the dark stairwell. I navigated to a hidden background partition I'd noticed earlier during my drive, but had been too panicked to inspect. It was an app titled Family Safe Locator. As the interface loaded, my stomach dropped into a cold pit of dread. I wasn't just a father being betrayed. I was a specimen in a digital cage. I saw a map of Cleveland peppered with red dots pulsing like fresh blood. Every movement I had made over the last 6 weeks was logged with terrifying precision, from my morning walks to the florist, where I bought Margaret's favorite lilies. He wasn't just waiting for me to die, I whispered, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. He was watching me live. The app didn't just track my location. It had been recording short bursts of audio whenever my heart rate exceeded 100 beats per minute. Silas had been monitoring my health for signs of a fatal natural decline, likely hoping the stress of his staged financial failures would do the work for him. Every doctor's visit, every grocery run, he knew exactly when I'd be most vulnerable. Red dots on a gray map. My life reduced to coordinates on a killer's screen. I realized Silas must have swiped my Apple ID credentials during our last dinner, installing the software remotely while I was in the kitchen, fetching him a second helping of the lasagna he pretended to love. My engineering mind, the one that had spent decades debugging complex aerospace code, took over. I dissected the software's permissions with clinical speed, digging through layers of submenus until I found the admin override buried in the system settings. Disabling the app felt like cutting a fishing line that had been hooked deep in my gut for weeks. I tapped the screen with a final decisive movement, watching the red dots vanish into the digital ether. You don't get to follow me anymore, Silas. The leash is broken. I was finally invisible to the man who shared my DNA. I scrolled to the very bottom of the logs looking for the last location Silas had visited before the app lost connection to the server. It wasn't my home and it wasn't his office. It was a specialized medical hardware store on the outskirts of the city. The invoice linked to the coordinate showed Silas had purchased a set of high-grade, untraceable hospital restraints designed for psychiatric patients. The distant, echoing thud of a closing fire door somewhere below sent a jolt of panic through me, the sticky, damp feeling of my palms making it hard to hold the glass of the phone. I looked at the phone screen one last time before it went dark, realizing that even if the app was dead, Silas still knew exactly where I was supposed to be in 20 minutes. He was expecting a victim, but I was bringing the truth. I shoved the phone into my pocket and pushed through the heavy service door to the parking garage, where the air smelled of wet concrete and salvation. The parking garage was a concrete throat damp and echoing, and I stepped into it, knowing that the woman waiting in the shadows was the only one who could help me stop my own funeral. Level B2 was a graveyard of silent vehicles lit by the flickering orange glow of sodium vapor lamps that made every shadow look like a predator. I scanned the dim expanse until I spotted a nondescript gray sedan parked near a support pillar. Detective Rachel Torres was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s, wearing a charcoal blazer that seemed to absorb the dim garage light as she stepped into my reality. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Her gaze was already locked onto the USB drive gripped in my hand. Audrey had moved ahead to ensure the coast was clear, but Torres was the one who held the power of the law. "I'm Detective Torres," she said, her voice a low, disciplined rasp. "Audrey said you had something Blackwell would kill for." "It is not just Blackwell," I replied, handing over the digital drive and feeling the crushing weight of the last few hours begin to transfer from my shoulders to her. "It is my son. Everything, the insurance, the theft, the murder plan, it's all on this drive." Detective Torres revealed she was already at the hospital tonight, having been tipped off by a different whistleblower, but she hadn't realized the victim was already on the inside fighting back. She gestured for me to follow her to the trunk of the sedan. She opened her laptop on the cold, abrasive metal of the car's trunk, and the blue, ghostly flicker of the screen illuminated her grim face against the gray walls. How many ghosts were walking these halls alongside me? 8. Moore Blackwell wasn't a surgeon. He was a harvester. I watched as she scrolled through the Zurich flight confirmations and the forged guardianship papers, her professional detachment beginning to fracture as she realized the depth of the depravity. She was cross-referencing the insurance policy details with an ongoing medical fraud case she'd been building for 3 years. Thane, she whispered, her fingers flying across the keys. I've been chasing Blackwell for 8 deaths. This drive, it is the confession I needed to close the net. Can you stop them? I asked, my voice barely audible over the rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe hitting a plastic bucket nearby. They plan to end it at 9 tomorrow morning. The laptop hummed, a thin electronic sound that signaled the end of a multi-million-dollar murder spree. She realized that I wasn't just a witness. I was the final piece of the puzzle that linked Silas's gambling debts to Blackwell's accidental surgical outcomes. As Torres closed a file, she pointed out a subdirectory I had missed in my haste. Blackwell had already drafted a statement of consent for organ donation, intended to be signed immediately after my cardiac arrest, to further profit from my remains. Every part of me had been appraised and sold before I was even dead. I felt a cold, righteous fury settle into my marrow. Torres looked up from the screen, her eyes hardening as she reached for her radio, but before she could speak, a pair of headlights swept across the concrete wall behind us. The distant, low-frequency rumble of a car engine elsewhere in the garage grew louder, echoing through the concrete throat like an approaching storm. I ducked behind the sedan's bumper, my heart hammering against the asphalt-scented air as the engine noise grew louder. I pressed my stomach against the cold, grit-covered concrete of the parking garage floor, watching the sweeping arc of headlights turn my shadow into a long, distorted needle. Beside me, Audrey Walsh was a statue of terrified silence, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the fender. A hospital security patrol vehicle slowly rounded the corner, its rhythmic orange strobe light flickering against the massive concrete pillars with the steady pulse of a warning beacon. "Don't move!" Detective Torres hissed, her voice a barely audible rasp that blended with the smell of burnt oil and cold asphalt. "If they see us, Blackwell gets a phone call, and this whole net collapses." I held my breath, the silence of the garage amplifying the thud of my pulse in my ears. Once the patrol car's taillights faded as it descended to a lower level, Torres pulled me back toward the laptop resting on her trunk. "Look at this Thane," she said, her face illuminated by a ghostly blue light. "This is how he sees you." She had decrypted a file from my son's personal cloud storage that made the physical murder plot seem almost merciful in comparison. The metadata on the Word document titled Dad's Funeral Speech Draft was a physical blow. It had been created 4 months ago. This was long before Silas's business had supposedly hit its unexpected breaking point. He hadn't been backed into a corner by debt. He had been building the corner himself. I began to read, the dry electronic heat rising from the laptop keyboard stinging my eyes. It was a meticulously written eulogy praising my life of service as an engineer and my unfailing heart, but it was the margins that turned my blood to slush. They were filled with red text stage directions, a director's notes for a performance of grief. Take a breath. Wipe the eyes. Look at the casket. My son, the director. Me, the lead corpse. Silas had scripted his own tears with the clinical precision of an actuary. Pause for breath here, the notes read. Look at Margaret's grave for sympathetic effect. He wasn't planning to bury a father. He was launching a marketing campaign to rebuild his social reputation while pocketing $5 million of blood money. How many times had he hugged me while mentally editing this script? How many I love yous were just line readings for a rehearsal I didn't know I was attending? The realization was an emotional desecration that left me hollow. It's not a speech, Mr. Garrison Torres noted, her eyes hardening as she watched me process the betrayal. It's a performance review for a murder. I reached the end of the document, where a special thanks section was already drafted. Silas intended to publicly validate Dr. Blackwell's heroic efforts to save me, providing the surgeon with the perfect professional shield. I was a prop he hadn't finished using yet, a stepping stone made of my own remains. My hands were trembling with a new level of cold fury a righteously angry clarity that replaced the last vestiges of my fear. I closed the laptop with a snap that felt like a bone breaking. I realized then that for Silas, I was already dead and buried. I was just a ghost, waiting for the curtain to rise on his greatest performance. Detective Torres didn't give me time to mourn the son I thought I had. She clicked onto a new folder on her laptop labeled Grant Financial. I thought I knew the depths of Silas's greed, but she was about to show me the jagged, blood-stained rocks at the bottom of the pit. The blue flickering light of the screen reflected off my sweat-beaded forehead as I leaned over the sedan's trunk. She scrolled through a financial dossier detailing Silas's hidden liabilities, and the numbers made my head swim. It revealed that Silas didn't just lose money on real estate. He had borrowed $850,000 from a high-interest predatory lender named Felix Grant. I recognized the name from the local news, a man with deep ties to organized crime who operated out of the city's shadows. Silas has been paying protection interest for months. Torres whispered, her voice competing with the sound of a distant police siren echoing through the concrete garage. But the principal hasn't moved, and Grant's patience has reached its terminal limit. I felt a sickening shift in perspective. Felix Grant doesn't sue people for breach of contract, Mr. Garrison, she added, her eyes meeting mine with a grim intensity. He uses a hacksaw. I realized then that my son was not just greedy. He was terrified. The file revealed an even darker layer. Felix Grant was actually the one who suggested Dr. Blackwell to Silas. The murder for insurance scheme wasn't just a desperate idea. It was a vetted service within the criminal underworld, a way for debtors to liquidate their own families to stay alive. $850,000, the price of a human life in the shadows. My life. The heavy laptop trunk felt like it was vibrating under my hands as Torres displayed a series of subpoenaed text messages. The bold black text on the screen was explicit. Grant had given Silas a hard deadline of November 15th to settle the debt in full or face what he called permanent restructuring. The messages mentioned my apartment and my assets as the only acceptable collateral left. Tick-tock. Silas' one message read, "Your father's life insurance is the only currency I'll accept now." I saw the dates and the timestamps. The faked car accident and the 9 a.m. surgery were accelerated specifically to meet this underworld deadline. He traded my heartbeat for his own skin. When a man is standing between a loan shark and a grave, does he even see a father anymore? Or just a pile of cash with a pulse? The air drifting from the garage entrance felt damp and ozone-heavy, signaling the storm outside was far from over. I scrolled further, finding a breakdown of the insurance payout. Natasha Crane wasn't just a bystander. Her legal cut of the millions was earmarked to pay off her own secret gambling debts to Grant. She was just as desperate and dangerous as Silas, two predators circling the same dying fire. I realized that Silas wasn't just running toward a new life in Zurich. He was running for his life, and I was the only thing he was willing to throw to the wolves. The boy I had taught to be brave had become a coward, who measured my worth in the frequency of a flatline. I stared at the screen until the text blurred into a series of jagged black lines, my filial pity dissolving into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. Torres's fingers flew across the keys, bypassing a secondary encryption layer that guarded the most horrific file yet. The spreadsheet didn't look like a list of human beings. It looked like a supermarket inventory where every line item was a heartbeat and every column was a cash value. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Audrey, the vibration of the garage's ventilation system humming through the concrete floor and into my very marrow. The file was titled Future Targets, a digital assembly line of souls waiting to be processed by Dr. Blackwell. I watched as Torres scrolled through a comprehensive list of 12 names, including my own, each accompanied by net worth estimates and life insurance policy details that were accurate to the penny. Local philanthropists, retired business owners, people who had spent their lives building something only to be reduced to a profit margin. Look at the status column, Thane Torres whispered, her face pale in the blue-white flicker of the laptop screen. Pending means they have already been admitted or are being actively monitored for a window of opportunity. This wasn't just a betrayal by my son. This was a massacre in slow motion, an industrial-scale operation that turned St. Catherine's from a place of healing into a slaughterhouse. Completed. A simple 9-letter word that meant a man was dead and a killer was rich. In the referral column, I saw Silas's initials next to my name, a permanent record of his treachery. But as the list scrolled down, Audrey's breath hitched a sharp, ragged sound in the damp air. At the bottom of the list, under the section marked in stark red as completed, several names were listed with timestamps from years ago. One name stood out in bold black text, David Walsh. Beside it was a note regarding a successful transfer of funds to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Have you ever felt the exact moment someone's world breaks? It's not loud. It's the sound of a sharp intake of breath and a heart turning to lead. Audrey's legs buckled the strength, leaving her as 12 years of doubt were ended by a single spreadsheet cell. I caught her before she hit the oil-stained pavement, the sharp, metallic smell of old oil and exhaust fumes filling my nose. I knew it, she sobbed, the sound swallowed by her dry throat. I knew he didn't just stop breathing. The initials next to her father's name weren't Silas's. They belonged to a former hospital board member, proving this rot reached the very top of the institution. Torres's eyes were hard as she dug further into the metadata, uncovering a hidden secondary beneficiary. Blackwell wasn't just doing this for the kickbacks from men like Silas. He was using a portion of every insurance payout to fund a private high-end surgical clinic in a non-extradition country. He was building a kingdom out of corpses. Audrey looked up from the screen, her tears drying into a mask of pure, crystalline hate. The grief that had driven her for over a decade had finally found its target, and the transformation was terrifying to behold. I realized in that moment that she was no longer just a whistleblower or a nurse seeking the truth. She was an executioner waiting for the signal. The blue light of the laptop died as Torres closed the lid with a finality that signaled the end of our gathering and the beginning of the hunt. My heart was cold, my mind sharp. We had the evidence, and now we had the fury. Detective Torres closed the laptop with a finality that signaled the end of the data gathering and the start of the hunt. The elevator cable groaned like a dying man as we ascended toward the 5th floor. The charcoal fabric of Detective Torres's blazer, the only solid thing in a world that had turned to smoke and mirrors. The metallic, oily smell of the elevator shaft clung to my throat, a reminder of the industrial gut of this building, where life and death were being traded like commodities. I felt a strange, cold detachment, the aerospace engineer's mind taking over to calculate the safest route through the renovated halls. My grief was still there, but it was boxed up secondary to the tactical precision required for the next 10 minutes. Torres was coordinated with her plainclothes team via encrypted earpieces, her voice a low, rhythmic murmur that didn't disrupt the silence of our ascent. When the doors hissed open, we moved with the synchronization of a single shadow. Audrey led the way, her eyes fixed and burning with that newfound crystalline hate. We had to bypass a sleepy guard at the junction of the service corridor. I watched the rhythmic flicker of a failing hallway light timing our crossing to the exact 3-second pulse of darkness. Wait for the strobe, I whispered more to myself than the others. 3 seconds of dark. Then we move. We slipped past the guard like ghosts and arrived back at the hidden perch of the observation deck overlooking room 512. Below us, the stage was set for a nightmare. Blackwell was handing Silas a burner phone, his face twisted into a mask of professional malice that made my skin crawl. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a jailer. He mentioned casually that he had already pre-signed a psychiatric hold for Audrey, intending to have her committed the moment my surgery was over to keep her quiet. Loose ends. To them, my neighbor wasn't a grandmother. She was a glitch in the software. Torres activated a high-gain directional microphone aimed at the glass, and the static-filled hiss of the pickup filled my earpiece. They were discussing Mrs. Emma Sterling, the sweet woman next door, who had always treated Silas like a second grandson. Mrs. Sterling saw me, Silas said, his voice stripped of all filial warmth. She's nosy, Marcus. She asks too many questions. Blackwell merely nodded, his surgical mask dangling like a noose from his neck. An elderly woman with a history of heart issues. A simple house call is all it takes to silence a witness. The cold-blooded horror of it made my breath hitch in the freezing draft of the hospital's overactive ventilation. Have you ever heard a man barter for a murder, like he was haggling over the price of a used car? It's a sound that never leaves your bones. Silas didn't stop at the neighbor. He suggested that if Natasha became unstable due to her mounting guilt, she should be the next complication on the list. His greed had no bottom. It was an abyss that would swallow everyone I had ever loved. I watched Silas's reflection appear distorted in the observation glass, a monstrous version of the son I thought I knew. "Target is in sight," Torres whispered into her comms. Audio pickup initiated. Blackwell's hand suddenly hovered over the intercom, his eyes drifting toward the observation window, as if he could sense the three of us breathing on the other side of the glass. I froze my fingers, digging into the recording device, watching the predator look for the prey. Torres's fingers curled around the grip of her service weapon. Her nod, the only signal that the time for watching was over. The heavy double doors of room 512 didn't just open. They exploded inward under the weight of 3 tactical officers, the sound of splintering wood final and absolute. The smell of gunpowder from the flashbang hung thick in the air, mixing with the blinding white strobes of the tactical lights that turned the room into a chaotic, high-contrast nightmare. "Police, this is Detective Rachel Torres, with a warrant for your arrest. Drop the vials. Hands where I can see them." The command was a roar that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the observation deck. I watched as Dr. Blackwell, the man who had treated human lives like supermarket inventory, fumbled. The syringe he had been holding, the one intended to deliver a chemical stop sign to my heart, slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the floor with a sharp, clinical clink, the glass shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds. Blackwell was slammed against the wall, his face a mask of indignation. "This is a mistake. I'm the chief of surgery," he shrieked. But the tactical boots didn't care for his titles. They crunched over the broken glass, pinning him down with efficient, ruthless force. Torres pulled a folded document from her jacket. "Silas Garrison, Natasha Crane, Marcus Blackwell. I have warrants issued by Judge Helena Marks for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and forgery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." In the corner, Natasha Crane collapsed like a marionette with cut strings, her high-pitched, jagged sobbing filling the room as she realized the flight to Zurich was a dead dream. Silas, however, was a statue. He stood frozen in the center of the floor, his vibrant arrogance draining away until he was a sickly, pale gray. Glass shards on the floor. A broken syringe, my life scattered and clinical. As Blackwell felt the cold steel of the cuffs, he didn't even hesitate to bark out a plea offering Silas's full confession in exchange for a lighter sentence. There is no loyalty among thieves, only the desperate math of self-preservation. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything about this final confrontation, if you're still watching this unfold with me, comment one word for what you're feeling right now. A quick note. The next part includes recreated details to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. If you are not comfortable with dramatized details, you're free to stop watching here. I stepped out from the observation deck, my presence acting as a physical blow that made Silas stumble back. I stood silent for a long moment, simply looking at the healthy, untouched man who had faked a tragedy to facilitate my murder. The officers cleared a path, allowing the victim to finally face his predator. Have you ever looked at your own child and seen only a stranger wearing a mask of your history? Dad Silas stammered, his trembling hands tightening as the zip ties bit into his wrists. You're supposed to be in the waiting room. I'm exactly where I need to be, Silas. I replied, my voice a gravely reflection of a soul that had survived its own funeral. I'm at the end of your script. Silas's face twisted from shock to a feral, cornered rage, his body tensing for a final, desperate act of violence. He looked around the room like a trapped animal, realizing that his lies had finally run out of runway. He tried to point at Natasha, his voice a frantic screech, claiming she was the one who poisoned his mind. But his words were just more noise in a room full of truth. The air in room 512 didn't just feel cold. It felt thin, as if Silas was sucking the oxygen out of the space as he prepared to lunge. I saw the muscles in his jaw ripple, his custom charcoal suit jacket tightening across his shoulders. He looked around the room like a trapped animal, realizing that his lies had finally run out of runway. Then Silas exploded into motion. He screamed a curse, a jagged guttural sound that carried all the entitlement and rot of his failed life, and lunged straight for my throat. A tactical officer stepped in to intercept him, but Silas twisted with a frantic, clumsy strength born of sheer desperation. He broke free for a split second, stumbling backward toward the open door of the suite. In his blind panic, his heel caught on a discarded medical cable snaking across the linoleum. He flailed his arms, windmilling as he fell backward with terrifying velocity toward a heavy metal server rack bolted to the wall. This was the very medical monitoring system he intended to use to watch my heart stop. Crack. A sound no father should ever hear. A sound the universe had been waiting to play. The dry, sickening thwack of bone-hitting, reinforced steel echoed through the corridor. Silas's neck struck the sharp edge of the rack, and he slumped to the floor in a heap. The room fell into a silence so heavy it was deafening, broken only by the chirping of a tactical radio and the smell of scorched electronics where the rack had been jarred. I moved toward him, my legs feeling like lead. Silas was lying on the floor, his eyes wide and tracking me with a primal animal terror, but the rest of him was eerily perfectly still. "Dad," he whispered, the arrogance replaced by a thin, thready wheeze. I can't feel my hands. Dad, please, I can't feel my hands. Don't move him. I barked, the engineer in me instinctively grasping the structural failure of his body. Audrey, get a C-collar. Audrey Walsh was already there, her face a mask of clinical detachment as she checked his vitals. He had faked a broken spine to steal my life. Now the spine was broken, and the life was truly gone. Is that justice or just gravity? As Audrey worked, she looked up at me, her eyes flashing with a grim realization. "Thane, look at the monitor," she said. The system Silas had set up to record my end was fully operational. It had captured the exact moment of his own spinal severance in high definition. Even more damning, she realized that the optimal condition report I had found in Blackwell's files, the one proving Silas was healthy just hours ago, meant he had no prior injury to blame for this. The fraud he built to bury me was now the evidence that would ensure he stayed in a cage. I looked down at my son, the man who faked paralysis to murder me, and saw the pupils of his eyes dilate in pure, dilated horror. He realized in that moment that he would never take another unassisted step as long as he lived. The irony wasn't just poetic. It was absolute. I stood over him, a father who had finally stopped trying to catch a falling star, watching as the weight of his own malice finally finished the job. The sirens outside the hospital had been a discordant symphony, but inside the corridor where Silas lay, everything had gone deathly quiet. 5 days had passed since that heavy silence, and now I found myself sitting in the police headquarters, surrounded by the smell of industrial cleaner and the dry, rasping sound of my own breath. The fluorescent lights of the precinct briefing room were unforgiving, but they were nothing compared to the cold clarity of the lab report sliding across the metal table toward me. Detective Rachel Torres sat opposite me, her face a mask of professional gravity. I touched the paper, noting its cold, granular texture. "It wasn't just the surgical sedative they found in your blood work, Thane." She began, her voice steady. "The lab flagged something much older and more insidious." She leaned forward, pointing to a series of chemical markers. "Your system is saturated with arsenic. This indicates a chronic low-dose poisoning that has been occurring for at least 3 months." The room seemed to tilt. I listened in a trance-like state as the clinical numbers translated into a timeline of Silas's frequent wellness visits. The report showed that the arsenic levels were specifically calibrated to mimic the symptoms of a rapidly progressing dementia. It was the foundation for his guardianship petition, a chemical lie to support a legal theft. "It wasn't just a one-night plan," Thane Torres said. "He's been killing you for months." My mind raced back to our Tuesday mornings. "He brought me coffee every single week." I whispered, the bitter, lingering ghost taste of that organic coffee blend suddenly coating my tongue like ash. "He called it his duty to look after me." Arsenic, the king of poisons. My son's gift to the father who gave him everything. I thought I was just getting old, but I was actually being erased. "Look at your fingernails, Mr. Garrison," Detective Torres instructed, her eyes never leaving mine. I held my hands out, noticing for the first time the distinct white horizontal bands stretching across the nail beds. "Those are called maze lines," she explained. "They are forensic markers of arsenic exposure. They are like rings on a tree, Thane. Every line is a scar from a time you were poisoned." I stared at them, the physical marks of a long-term betrayal etched into my own flesh. The fatigue, the tingling in my feet, I had attributed it all to the natural decay of 68 years. How do you count the days when your own body was becoming a crime scene? One cup of organic coffee at a time, I felt a visceral revulsion, a cold horror that seeped into my marrow. I wasn't just a target. I was a project. Torres cleared her throat, her voice dropping an octave. "We executed a search warrant on the family home, Thane. We found a matching arsenic container hidden in Silas's childhood bedroom. He had used the very place of his upbringing, the room where you tucked him in, to store the tools of your murder." I traced the white lines on my nails, knowing that if the hospital trap hadn't happened, I would have been a natural casualty by Christmas, mourned by a son with my blood under his fingernails. The betrayal had no floor, no ceiling, and apparently no end. I sat in that sterile room, identifying the physical marks of his greed, realizing that my son hadn't just wanted my estate. He had been comfortably watching me rot from the inside out, while smiling over a breakfast table. Torres did not let me sink into the horror of my own poisoning. She had a second recording, one that would break what was left of my heart. I thought I had already hit the bottom of the abyss, but Detective Torres was about to show me that Silas had dug a second, deeper grave for the only woman I ever loved. I sat in the interrogation observation room, the hard plastic chair biting into my spine as I stared through the two-way glass. On the other side sat a shackled doctor, Marcus Blackwell, his hands twitching with a nervous, rhythmic energy that mocked his former surgical precision. The cold, metallic smell of the precinct ventilation felt like it was freezing the blood in my veins. Through the speakers, Blackwell's voice was muffled and distorted, but the words were clear enough to shatter my soul. Desperate to avoid a lethal injection of his own, the doctor had begun to barter. He described a meeting 3 years ago in a dimly lit steakhouse where Silas had approached him with a financial problem. Margaret was blocking access to a $1.2 million trust fund that Silas needed immediately to cover a collapsing real estate deal. Blackwell revealed that Silas actually watched the heart rate monitors from the nurse's station via a remote feed, nodding his approval as his mother's heart stopped. He didn't ask if it would hurt her. Blackwell droned, his tone flat and clinical. He only asked if it would be traceable. $80,000. That was the price Silas put on his mother's heart. I felt a mounting nausea that threatened to choke me. 80,000. 3 years of silence. One stopped heart. The math of a monster. Blackwell confessed to administering a lethal dose of potassium chloride during Margaret's routine cardiac catheterization. He explained how he falsified the monitors to mimic a sudden natural arrest, knowing my trust in the system would prevent an autopsy. "I watched him hug you at the cemetery, Mr." Garrison Blackwell said, and I saw Torres's grim, steady reflection in the glass as she watched me. I remember thinking he was the best actor I had ever hired. Silas's grief at the funeral hadn't been a shroud. It was a cloak, hiding the blood on his hands while he leaned on my shoulder. "She passed thinking he was her brave boy," I whispered to the empty observation room. "She was taken for a trust fund." I collapsed back into the chair, the weight of the realization destroying my last shred of paternal instinct. The betrayal was not a recent infection. It was a terminal cancer that had been eating my family from the inside for years. I discovered then that Silas had used the money from Margaret's trust fund to pay the initial premiums on the very insurance policy intended to profit from my own passing. He had used the proceeds of orchestrating his mother's death to fund the machinery for mine. The cycle of greed was perfect, circular, and utterly heartless. Have you ever looked at your own child and seen only a stranger wearing a mask of your history? I realized then that Silas didn't just want me gone. He had been orchestrating the passing of his own family members for years, and I was simply the last obstacle on his ledger. Torres leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Thane, we can't perform toxicology after 3 years. The body has decomposed too far." But Blackwell's recorded confession, combined with hospital records, showing he administered the injection and falsified the cardiac arrest report, is sufficient to charge Silas with orchestrating Margaret's death. The evidence is solid. He will answer for what he did to her. I stared at the man behind the glass, but all I saw was the ghost of the woman I failed to protect. Torres handed me a handkerchief. I didn't realize I needed her eyes, signaling that the horror wasn't finished. Betrayal is a debt that never stops collecting interest, and Silas had spent the last 3 years pawning off my soul one piece of gold at a time. I followed her into the digital forensics lab, where the hum of cooling fans felt like a cold wind from the grave. She opened a folder labeled Exit Strategy on the workstation. I leaned in, staring at a grainy Canadian passport photo of a man named Daniel Clark. The man had my son's eyes and his precise, calculated smirk. He wasn't just killing me. He was killing himself to become a ghost. Chills ran down my spine as I reviewed the contracts within the folder. Silas had arranged for the purchase of an unclaimed cadaver from a European body broker, specifically selected to match his own age and height. Most chillingly, the cadaver had a pre-existing spinal injury to provide a physical explanation for the faked Swiss car crash that was supposed to occur after my murder. The dental records swap was already scheduled. Daniel Clark, a ghost with my son's eyes. A phantom built on a stranger's corpse. The complexity of the fraud was clinical. A masterpiece of erasure designed to let him vanish into Zurich with Natasha and my $5 million. I felt a heavy, hollow weight in my chest. Torres then pulled a physical stack of receipts from her briefcase found in the back of Silas's closet. They were from a local pawn shop in the industrial district. My heart stopped when I saw the descriptions: 1 platinum engagement ring with a round-cut diamond, 1 triple-strand pearl necklace. Days later, I stood in the biting Cleveland wind, my thin coat offering no protection against the cold that seemed to come from inside my own bones. I pushed open the door to the shop, met by the sharp, metallic smell of old cigarettes and copper. The dusty, yellowed light of the shop's front window illuminated rows of forgotten lives. "I'm sorry, sir," the clerk said, the sound of a heavy steel safe being slammed shut punctuating his words. "Those items were moved to a private collector last week." I looked at the receipts again, my vision blurring. He had sold them on the anniversary of Margaret's death. He chose the most painful date on the calendar to turn her legacy into walking around money. The jewelry wasn't just gold and stones. It was the physical weight of Margaret's laugh, and Silas had sold it by the ounce. He sold her pearls. He sold the only things she wanted to pass down to a family he was busy dismantling. I stood there listening to the muffled roar of traffic outside, feeling the absolute poverty of a man who still has a bank account, but no longer has a home. My son had treated my wife's memory as small change to fund his gambling debts and the assassination of his only remaining parent. I looked at the empty display case and realized that while the police had caught the killers, I was the one left standing in the ruins of a life that had been sold out from under me. Every heirloom was a memory he had traded for a ticket to a life that didn't include me. The truth was a fire that refused to be contained, and I knew where I had to go next. I didn't want to be the one to break Robert's heart, but the truth was a fire that refused to be contained, and I was carrying the match that would burn his world to the ground. Robert Sterling, my oldest friend, opened the door with a face that looked like it had been carved out of grief and gray Cleveland winters. He seemed thinner than when I saw him last, his skin clinging to his cheekbones like parchment. I stepped into the foyer, immediately met by the smell of stale tea and old upholstery that had come to define his home since David passed. Robert offered me a seat in the living room, sensing the gravity of my visit in the way I wouldn't meet his eyes. We sat in a sudden silence, punctuated only by the muffled ticking of a clock that seemed to count the seconds of our shared loss. "Robert," I said, my voice heavy as lead, "I need to tell you about David. He didn't choose to leave you." Robert's brow furrowed, his labored, whistling breath the only other sound in the room. "What are you saying, Thane?" "The police said it was an overdose. David had his struggles, but he was getting better." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the physical copies of the spreadsheet Blackwell had kept. I pointed to David's name marked with the chilling status of completed, next to Silas's referral initials. I explained the debt, the referral, and the orchestrated end that followed. Completed. 18 months of mourning a lie, ended by a single word in a digital ledger. Robert's initial denial was a physical shield, but it collapsed under the weight of the data I presented. I had to deliver the final jagged truth. Silas hadn't just orchestrated the procedure. He had served as a pallbearer at the funeral, carrying the casket of the man he had arranged to have removed for $120,000. How do you tell your best friend that your own blood is the reason his legacy is a headstone? "My son orchestrated the passing of your boy for $100,000, Robert whispered, his voice cracking as dust motes danced in a single shaft of afternoon sun. David trusted him. They were like brothers. "He orchestrated the end of everything for both of us, Robert," I replied, feeling the cold, trembling texture of his hand as he reached across the table. "We are the only ones left to make him pay." Instead of the explosion, I expected Robert found a terrifying clarity in his anger. His grief solidified into a cold, communal steel. He stood up, walking toward a small wooden box on the mantel. He revealed he had kept David's phone all this time, a relic he couldn't bring himself to charge until now. It contains a final, unopened voicemail from Silas. He said, his eyes locking onto mine. It was the invitation to the procedure that took my son from me. Robert gripped my hand with a strength that shouldn't have been in his aged fingers, his eyes locking onto mine with a shared, silent promise we wouldn't stop until Silas Garrison was buried in paper and steel. The room, once a sanctuary of sorrow, had become a war room. We were no longer just two aging fathers. We were the architects of a long overdue reckoning. The truth had finally finished burning through the lies, leaving only the heat of a shared mission for justice. I looked at Robert, seeing in his eyes the same transformation I had undergone. We had both lost sons, his to Silas's greed, mine to his own corruption. But we would ensure that David Sterling's memory and Margaret's would be honored, not with tears, but with testimony that would echo through a courtroom and seal Silas's fate forever. The courthouse steps were slick with the first rain of October, a cold reminder that the season of reckoning had finally arrived. 6 months of legal battles had led to this moment. Blinding white flashes from media cameras exploded around me like artillery. As I navigated the swarm of reporters, their shouted questions lost in the heavy thrum of the morning. I moved through the metal detectors and into the sanctuary of the stone hallways, where the smell of old paper and floor polish offered a clinical kind of comfort. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a groan that sounded like the iron gates of a prison. And for the first time in 5 months, I was breathing the same air as the man who tried to auction off my life. I took my seat in the gallery, my eyes instantly finding the gurney at the front of the room. Silas was wheeled in with a rhythmic mechanical hum from the ventilator on his gurney, his neck stabilized by a rigid plastic brace. He was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with his pale, wasted skin. Orange, the color of a sunset. The color of my son's new skin. His previous arrogance had been replaced by a visible, shivering terror that made his frame seem small. "I am Thane Garrison, and I am here to witness the end of a lie," I whispered, as the judge called the court to order. The prosecution began laying out the physical evidence, the bottles of arsenic, the signatures forged with a clinical hand, and the recorded conversations that had been pulled from the shadows. Silas's defense attorney stood attempting a desperate gambit. He argued that the arsenic was self-administered by me in a staged suicide attempt meant to frame my son for my business failures. I watched Silas as this lie was spoken, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. Have you ever sat 10 feet away from your own murderer and had to explain why you didn't die? It's a surreal kind of math. When I was called to the stand, the cold, polished wood of the witness stand railing felt like the only solid thing in the room. I recounted the night of the accident, the frantic drive, and the moment Audrey pulled me to safety. I spoke about the sensation of seeing those white maze lines on my nails, and the realization that my own son had been poisoning my coffee for months. My voice remained steady, the discipline of an aerospace engineer presenting a failure analysis on his own life. "Did you believe your son loved you, Mr. Garrison?" the prosecutor asked. "I believed in a boy that never existed," I replied. "I gave him my heart. He just wanted the policy payout." To destroy the suicide narrative, I produced a secret recording I'd made months ago. It wasn't of a crime, but of Silas laughing with Natasha about how the old man is finally losing his grip. The sound of his genuine mocking laughter filled the silent courtroom, shattering the defense's house of cards. A heavy gavel struck the bench like a gunshot echoing off the mahogany walls. I looked directly into Silas's eyes as I stepped down, and for the first time, the mask of the victim slipped. The shivering boy vanished, revealing a snarl of such pure, crystalline hatred that the entire courtroom went cold. He didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like the end of a long, dark road. The clock on the courtroom wall didn't tick. It throbbed each second a pulse in a room where a father and son waited for the law to slice the final chord between them. The jury was out for only 3 hours, but in the silence of the waiting room, it felt like 3 decades. Now, back in courtroom 4B, a heavy silence fell as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. I watched Silas, his body strapped into the gurney, the fluorescent lights glinting off the cold plastic of his medical brace. The foreman cleared his throat. "We find the defendant, Silas Garrison, guilty on all counts. Attempted murder, first-degree murder of David Walsh, forgery, grand larceny." The hammer of justice didn't just fall, it crushed. As the judge read the sentence, consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, Silas began to wail. It was a thin, pathetic sound, stripped of the rehearsed dignity he had scripted in his own funeral draft. It was the sound of a cornered animal realizing the cage was permanent. Dr. Blackwell remained an icy statue of professional ruin next to him, his eyes dead as the judge ordered both men to be transferred to the State Correctional Facility's medical infirmary wing. Silas tried to disrupt the proceedings, shouting a desperate final performance about how he was born this way because of my neglect. but the courtroom remained unmoved. His voice was just noise against the thud of the judge's gavel. Guilty. Why did the word feel like a weight instead of a wing? I sat there, feeling a tremendous relief that clashed violently with the profound mourning of a father whose legacy was now a public record of depravity. The bailiffs began to wheel Silas out of the room. For a brief second, the gurney paused near my seat, and our eyes met. I didn't see a monster or a mastermind. I saw a broken man who had traded his soul for a ledger that came up empty. He was my blood, but we were strangers separated by a sea of arsenic and insurance forms. Life without parole. A medical cell. The irony was a jagged pill. I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked toward the exit. Detective Torres and Audrey Walsh met me in the hallway. I shook their hands, the debt I owed them far beyond any words I could offer. It is over. Thane Torres said, her voice soft against the smell of damp wool and rain drifting in from the courthouse lobby. He can't hurt anyone ever again. Justice is a cold comfort when you're the last one left at the table, I replied. As they led the conspirators away, Torres leaned in and whispered that they had found one more secret, an offshore account Silas had labeled as a hit fund for Audrey, intended for use if she ever resurfaced. His malice truly had no bottom. I stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the sound of the rain hissing against the stone as it began to wash the city soot away. I stood on the wet pavement and reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the one thing the police hadn't taken into evidence, the small silver key to a house that no longer belonged to me. The legal closure was finalized, but the personal void was a vast, echoing chamber. I looked up at the gray Cleveland sky, letting the cold spring rain hit my face, realizing that the hardest part of surviving was figuring out what to do with the life I had fought so hard to keep. I thought the silence of my empty apartment would be a sanctuary, but instead it was just a vacuum waiting to be filled by the next person who wanted to profit from my survival. 3 weeks after the trial, the hallways of my life still felt haunted by the arsenic and the forged signatures. I was attempting to sort through a mountain of mail when I found a nondescript manila envelope slipped under my door. Inside were high-resolution surveillance photos of me meeting Detective Torres in the hospital parking garage, grainy black and white textures of my most vulnerable moments. The typed demand beneath them was a cold splash of reality. Jessica Morgan's name on the letterhead was elegant, but the demands beneath it were written with the jagged edge of a desperate predator. You survived the son, Thane. Now you have to pay the partner, the letter read, claiming she was entitled to a $500,000 consultation fee for the information she provided Silas. Information that had nearly put me in a crematorium. The letter revealed that Jessica Morgan was the one who originally tipped off Felix Grant about my insurance policy, making her the true architect of the financial hit that nearly erased me. $500,000 by Friday, or the police find out about your illegal hack into Blackwell's server. When does the line of people waiting to pick at my carcass finally end? Is there a number I have to take? I felt a weary shock transition into a simmering, righteous indignation. I wasn't going to be a line item in someone else's ledger ever again. I took the envelope straight to the precinct. The smell of lemon wax in Detective Torres's office offered a grounding, professional contrast to the scent of stale fear in my apartment. Rachel's face hardened as she examined the photos. Jessica Morgan is a high-level corporate fixer. She explained, her voice competing with the sound of a heavy stapler echoing in the quiet hallway. She stayed under the radar because Silas was her shield, but his arrest froze the assets she was counting on. She's desperate, Thane. Blackmail. A coward's tax. I wasn't paying it. I am done running, Rachel, I said, watching the setting sun cast long orange shadows across her cluttered desk. Tell me how we trap her. We set up a dead drop at the industrial wharf, Torres replied, her eyes flashing with tactical interest. You show up with the cash, and we show up with the cuffs. She leaned over her terminal, pulling up Jessica's file, and her breath hitched. Thane Jessica is the daughter of the hospital board member who referred David Walsh to Blackwell 12 years ago. This isn't just business for her. It's a family legacy of blood money. As I walked out of the precinct, the cold, heavy weight of the wiretap device in my palm felt like the only anchor I had left. I realized that to end this, I had to walk back into the mouth of the wolf one last time. The engineer in me was gone, replaced by a man who had learned that the only way to stop a predator was to become the architect of their downfall. I gripped the silver key in my pocket, the one that used to represent home, and realized that my real life wouldn't begin until the last ghost was laid to rest in the dark waters of the wharf. The lock on my front door didn't resist. It yielded with a smooth, silent treachery that told me the sanctuary of my home had already been breached. I had returned at midnight, expecting the heavy stillness of a quiet night before the sting operation at the wharf. Instead, as I stepped into the foyer, I immediately sensed a change in the air. The faint, sharp, antiseptic scent of a hospital that had no business being in my living room. Before I could reach for the light switch, a figure lunged from behind the coat rack with a jagged, desperate speed. It was Jessica Morgan. Her eyes were wide, burning with a manic fervor that bypassed the professional fixer persona I had seen in the surveillance photos. "You think you are safe because the police are watching the wharf." She hissed, her voice a ragged, wet sound in the dark. She didn't want the blackmail money anymore. She wanted the prize Silas had promised her. "Silas sends his regards from the infirmary, Thane. He told me about the hidden Swiss account. It is mine the moment you stop breathing." She pinned me against the wall, the cold, abrasive texture of the wallpaper biting into my neck. In the pale moonlight, I saw the glint of a steel needle. Glass, steel, death in a 5-inch tube. Silas's final signature. I fought back with a desperation born of months of predation, my engineering mind frantically searching for a leverage point against her smaller but younger frame. I gripped her wrist, my knuckles white, but she was fueled by a terrifying, singular greed. The struggle wasn't just about the needle. It was about the gravity of a family tree that only knew how to grow thorns. "It is potassium chloride, Thane." She snarled, the tip of the syringe grazing the skin of my throat. "Just like your wife." I felt the cold bite of the metal, and for a second, I thought the architect had finally finished my blueprint. Suddenly, the front door exploded inward, the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the hallway carpet sounding like a heartbeat of salvation. Police dropped the weapon. "Get on the ground." The room flooded with light, as Torres's surveillance team, who had been monitoring the wiretap I was still wearing, swarmed the space. Jessica was tackled, the syringe flying from her hand to land on the carpet. As the officers dragged her toward the door, her composure shattered. She screamed that Silas had a fallback plan, her voice echoing with a chilling, hysterical edge. She claimed the syringe was tainted with a rare blood-borne pathogen, a slow and untraceable backup to ensure my death, even if the initial dose failed. I slumped against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps, watching as the handcuffs clicked into place. I looked at the discarded syringe on my carpet, the amber liquid pooling like a toxic tear in the synthetic fibers. The realization was a physical weight that nearly crushed my lungs. Even behind bars, paralyzed and defeated, my son was still reaching out from his cell to try and stop my heart. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated malice, a predator that wouldn't stop until one of us was in the ground. I touched the graze on my neck, feeling the stinging heat of the metal's passage, and knew there was only one thing left for me to do. I had to see him one last time, not as a father, but as a survivor delivering a final verdict. The reinforced glass of the visitation booth was cold against my palm, a thick, transparent wall between the man I had raised and the monster he had become. I entered the maximum security medical infirmary, where the air tasted of ozone and stale recycled oxygen. Silas was wheeled to the other side, his wasted, pale legs visible beneath the thin hospital sheet that draped over his gurney. A ventilator hummed beside him with a rhythmic, mechanical persistence, a sound that would define the rest of his existence. The cervical spinal fracture he'd suffered during his arrest 5 months ago had severed his connection to everything below his shoulders. He was now completely dependent on the ventilator, breathing only through the machine's forced rhythm via his tracheostomy. A nurse had attached a Passy-Muir speaking valve to his tracheostomy tube, deflating the cuff just enough to allow a thin stream of air past his vocal cords. But the damage to his C3 to C4 vertebrae meant his diaphragm was paralyzed. Every word he spoke had to be timed perfectly with the ventilator's exhale cycle. And even then, his voice was barely more than a harsh, whispering rasp. I picked up the visitation handset, the cold, greasy texture of the plastic, a reminder of the thousands of desperate conversations that had happened in this stall. I already knew the truth from the tapes Detective Torres played for me, but I needed to see him like this to witness the poetic justice of a man who faked paralysis, now condemned to live it. Silas looked at me, his eyes bitter and devoid of the theatrical grief he once used to manipulate me. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's mechanical breath. He struggled to speak, his mouth forming words that came out in fragmented, painful bursts. The ventilator hissed. Inhale, exhale. On the exhale, he forced out a single word. Wanted. The machine cycled again. Hiss. Inhale. Exhale. You. Another cycle. Hiss. Inhale. Exhale. See. It took him nearly 20 seconds to form a complete thought, each word a battle against his broken body. Wanted. You. See. Her. Face. His eyes burned with impotent rage as he waited for the next exhale cycle. When. Needle. Went. In. The ventilator's rhythm was unforgiving. He had to wait, trapped in silence between breaths, for the machine to give him permission to speak. Each pause was a prison within a prison. I leaned closer to the glass, watching him struggle. You didn't just want my money, Silas? I replied, my voice a gravely reflection of a soul that had finally found its footing. You wanted my ghost. Another mechanical breath. Hiss. Inhale. Exhale. Want. Ed. You. No. Pause. Hiss. Inhale. Exhale. Was. Me. The effort of speaking was exhausting him. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His eyes pleaded for the ventilator to cycle faster, but the machine was indifferent to his desperation. He tried to continue, but the nurse monitoring his vitals stepped forward, shaking her head. That's enough. His oxygen saturation is dropping. Any more talking and we'll have to sedate him. I watched the dust motes dancing in the sterile fluorescent light between us, feeling a chilling realization of his irredeemable evil. He had faked the very condition that now defined his existence, and the universe had completed the circuit with brutal efficiency. I leaned in closer to the glass, knowing he would have to wait for the ventilator's next cycle to even comprehend my words. I came here to tell you that the Swiss accounts have been seized for victim restitution, I said slowly, giving each word time to land. You have nothing left to barter for protection or comfort in this place. Robert Sterling and Audrey have helped me track down every heirloom you pawned. Your attempts to liquidate our history have been erased. Silas's face contorted. He tried to speak, but the ventilator was in its inhale cycle. He had to wait, his mouth moving silently, the words trapped in his paralyzed chest. When the exhale finally came, he forced out a desperate, fragmented plea. Don't. Pause. Hiss. Inhale. Exhale. Leave. Me. Pause. Hiss. Inhale. Exhale. Dad. The word hung in the air between us, distorted by the mechanical hiss of the machine that kept him alive. How do you mourn someone who is still breathing, but has been dead to you for years? I looked at him one last time, seeing only a patient in a cage, a structural failure of a human being that I could no longer repair. The boy who once ran to me with scraped knees was gone. In his place was a shell, breathing only because a machine forced air into his lungs. I have legally changed my last name, I told him, my voice devoid of anger. I have relocated. When you eventually die in this infirmary, Silas, there will be no garrison left to claim the body. The state will handle your remains. The name dies with your crimes. The weight of the last few months truly lifted, then leaving a hollow but clean space in my chest. I hung up the handset, the click echoing in the small booth. Through the glass, I watched him struggle to form one more word, his mouth moving desperately as he waited for the ventilator's exhale. But I was already walking toward the heavy steel doors, the mechanical buzzing of the locks sounding like a final verdict. I didn't look back, not even when the ventilator's alarm began to sound, a sharp electronic wail triggered by his elevated heart rate and dropping oxygen levels. The nurse rushed in to adjust his settings, but I kept walking. His pathetic attempt to call out after me was quickly swallowed by the rhythmic hum of the prison's industrial fans and the relentless, mechanical breathing of the machine that was now his only companion. I stepped out into the sunlight, a man with no son and no past, but with a future that finally belonged entirely to me. Behind me in that sterile medical cell, Silas would spend the rest of his life waiting for a machine to give him permission to breathe, to speak, to exist. He had faked paralysis to end my life. Now he would live paralysis until his own life ended. The irony wasn't just poetic, it was absolute. Shadows of the razor wire crawled across the asphalt as I pulled into the prison parking lot, a jagged reminder that some bonds aren't broken by love, but by necessity. I had returned for one final administrative obligation, a ghost visiting the graveyard of my past. The air inside the administrative wing smelled of floor wax and stale air, a scent that had become synonymous with my son's downfall. Dr. Aris Thorne, the prison's medical lead, had eyes that had seen too many lost causes to be surprised by my refusal. He sat across from me in a cramped, sterile office, a stack of stark white medical forms laid out between us like a challenge. Beside him, a social worker named Miller watched me with a cautious, practiced neutrality. "Without your signature, the therapy will be discontinued," Dr. Thorne said, his voice flat. "He will remain immobile. These experimental treatments are high cost, and the state will not cover them without a private guarantor." I looked at the unsigned forms, the spaces for my name yawning like open graves. I had discovered that Silas had already been using his limited phone privileges to call my old business associates, spinning a web of lies to solicit charity for his care. By playing the victim, he was still trying to use my name as a currency. "Then he will have a lot of time to think," I replied calmly. "I am no longer his legal guardian, and I am done signing for his mistakes." The pen stayed in my pocket. The scratch of a nib never touched that paper. Signature required. Signature denied. I watched the realization sink in that they were looking at a man who had finally run out of forgiveness. The irony was a physical weight in the room. Thorne revealed that the state-mandated care Silas would now receive was the exact same basic oversight plan Silas had intended for me in that overflow psychiatric unit. I was simply letting the universe complete the circuit. I was granted one last look at him through a reinforced observation window in the medical ward. Though I refused to step foot inside, Silas was staring at the ceiling, his body a motionless weight on the thin mattress. His eyes were unfocused and hollow through the glass, oblivious to the fact that his last lifeline had just been severed. "Do you want to speak to him one last time?" Miller asked softly. "No," I said, handing back my visitor badge. Everything that needed to be said was written in blood months ago. I realized then that the man in that bed was just a stranger now, a biological error I had finally corrected, by walking away. I turned toward the exit, my pace steady and unhurried. The heavy mechanical clunk of the steel doors locking behind me sounded like the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. As I stepped through the final security gate, the air didn't just feel fresher. It felt like it finally belonged to me again. The shadow of the razor wire no longer felt like it was reaching for me. I knew exactly where I had to go to bury the last of the Garrison name. I walked toward my car, leaving the monster in his cage, and the father I used to be in the dust of the parking lot. The horizon was clear for the first time in 3 years, and I was finally ready to face it alone. The drive to the cemetery was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. A silence that didn't need to be filled with excuses or lies. The gravel of the cemetery path crunched under my boots, a grounding rhythmic sound that felt like the first honest thing I'd felt in years. I walked past the rows of weathered granite until I reached Margaret's headstone, the air around it smelling of damp earth and late summer lilies. I sat on the grass and pulled a sealed envelope from my pocket, one I'd found tucked behind an old family photo of us at the lake. The yellowed stationery carried a faint vanilla scent that brought her back to me for a fleeting second. Margaret had written it weeks before she died. In her elegant looping script, she told me she was proud of the man I was, but her words also carried a subtle, heartbreaking fear about the storm gathering in Silas's nature. "I hope you always choose yourself, Thane," she wrote. "You were always the anchor, not the chain." I ran my thumb over her name, the heavy guilt I had carried for Silas's failure finally beginning to evaporate. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see the storm, Margaret," I whispered to the wind. Taped to the back of the letter was a cold, smooth safety deposit key I had been searching for. It wasn't for a bank account, but for a box containing the original deed to our family home, the one Silas had supposedly sold. With that deed, I knew I could finally sue the developers for the fraudulent sale and reclaim the ground we had built our lives on. Voided. The policy was ash. My price was zero again, and I'd never felt wealthier. I left the cemetery and drove to St. Catherine's Hospital one last time. I didn't go to the wards, I went to the administrative wing. I found Audrey Walsh in a sun-drenched office, her name etched in gold on a glass door. She was the hospital's first chief of ethics, a new watchman for a system that had once been a slaughterhouse. She looked at me from behind her desk, and I saw a peace in her eyes that matched my own. She showed me the bright, clinical white of the voided insurance documents. The $5 million was gone, redirected to a trust for the families of Blackwell's victims. It was the final balance for David Walsh. "They're calling it the Garrison Protocol," Audrey said. "No more dark wards, Thane." "You look good in a seat of power, Audrey," I replied. "Keep them honest." As I prepared to leave, Audrey dropped one last truth on me. She revealed that the tip that had saved my life in the parking garage hadn't come from her father's files at all. It came from a confession note Natasha Crane had mailed to herself weeks earlier as an insurance policy against Silas. Even the conspirators didn't trust the monster they were feeding. I looked at the chief of ethics plaque on her door, and then down at my new passport in my pocket. The name inside it was unfamiliar, and clean a blank slate for a man who had finally outlived his own murder. I walked out of the hospital and toward the airport, the morning sun finally burning away the last of the gray Cleveland fog. I wasn't an anchor or a chain anymore. I was just a man stepping into the light. The airport terminal was a sea of anonymous faces, and for the first time in my life, I was thrilled to be just another ripple in the water. Steam rose from the porcelain cup in a lazy, unhurried spiral, a stark contrast to the jagged adrenaline-fueled months that had nearly claimed my life. It was a Sunday morning 6 months after the trial, and I was sitting in the quiet sunroom of Robert Sterling's new apartment. The air smelled of fresh rain and the warm, nutty aroma of Sunday morning coffee. We sat in the comfortable shorthand of old friends, our voices no longer burdened by the heavy, suffocating secrets of our son's crimes. Robert looked stronger, the gray Cleveland winter finally losing its grip on his posture. He leaned forward, tapping a folder on the table. The first 3 grants were approved yesterday, Thane. David and Margaret would be proud. The Walsh Garrison Foundation was finally alive, a fund designed to provide legal and medical protection for the elderly against corporate predation. It's a good use for the money that was supposed to be my shroud, Robert, I replied. I felt a deep, earned peace settle into my bones. I revealed to him then that I hadn't just moved my money into the trust. I had used my engineering expertise to design the Foundation's secondary security audit system. It was a digital fail-safe, a series of algorithmic checks to ensure no doctor like Blackwell could ever manipulate a ward or a patient's charts again. My work was the silent guardian, the propulsion system for a legacy of safety. Grief is a heavy coat, but today the sun was hot enough to make me finally leave it on the bench. After our coffee, I took a final walk through the public park before heading to the airport for my move to the coast. The visual of the golden October light filtering through the turning leaves was breathtaking, a palette of reds and oranges that looked like a new beginning rather than an end. I heard the sound of children laughing in the park, distant and bright, a melody of life continuing unabated. I stopped by a bench, feeling the gentle, coastal-bound breeze against my face. I checked my watch, the simple mechanical piece that was a gift from Margaret decades ago. Its cool, smooth weight on my wrist was a constant reminder of a love that the greed of a son could never liquidate. I realized that while I could never get back the years stolen by Silas's predation, I had gained a clarity most people never find. I'm not a victim, and I'm not 156 anymore. Goodbye, Cleveland. Thanks for the scars. They make the skin tougher. As I boarded my plane and settled into the cabin, I received a final notification on my phone. The developers who had tried to pave over my history had been defeated. The city had reclaimed the land of my old home, and it was being turned into the Margaret Garrison Memorial Garden. I settled into my seat and looked out at the clouds as the engines began to hum. I reached into my pocket and touched the small silver key. It wasn't a reminder of the house I lost, but the tool that finally unlocked my future. I was no longer running away from a ghost. I was flying toward a life I finally owned, as clear and open as the sky outside the window. Looking back now, I realized this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a lesson written across my own life. I loved, blindly trusted, without question, and ignored the quiet warnings that something was wrong. If there's one thing I want you to take from this family story, it's this: love your family, but never abandon your judgment. A family story can hold warmth, loyalty, and hope, but it can also hide the darkest betrayals if we refuse to see clearly. What happened to me was never the path I wanted, yet the road of dad revenge wasn't really about vengeance. It was about survival, truth, and protecting what little remained of my life. Sometimes a dad revenge moment is simply a father refusing to disappear quietly. My family story taught me that dignity matters more than inheritance, and that justice, even painful justice, can set a soul free. I believe God allowed me to walk through that darkness so I could understand the value of clarity and courage. If you ever see warning signs in your own life, don't ignore them the way I did. Protect yourself, ask questions, trust wisdom over comfort. And if you're wondering what this dad revenge journey ultimately gave me, it gave me peace, the kind that only comes when truth finally stands in the light. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Now I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Thane's position, discovering a deadly betrayal inside your own family? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. And a small note: while inspired by themes of family betrayal and justice, parts of this narrative were dramatized for storytelling. If this style of story isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that might suit you better.